Well, good afternoon. You feeling good? Still got some energy? Well, we have a blockbuster session for you. And I say that because we had the critical ingredients that you all voted on this morning. Remember when we took that poll? And the question was, what are the key ingredients to actually create shared value? So we've got the CEOs. We have the unconventional partnerships we'll be talking about. And we have this important link with strategy. And we're going to have a lot of fun. And we're going to have a drink after this, okay? So this is some fun before we actually have a drink at about 5:45. But, I'm thrilled to be joined by these three leaders of shared value. Today we've been sort of layering on various pieces of shared value, from strategy to partnerships to talking about social issues. And I think, a question that is commonly asked is, how do you bring all these things together? How do you embed shared value in an organization? And I'm being very careful in saying organization, because I'm not referring only to businesses, but to nonprofit, non-governmental organizations as well. And I think what's fascinating is that you get to hear from the people where the buck stops, so to speak, and their journey, a fascinating journey that they've all been on. They've all been in different places, different sort of entry points as they have been embedding shared value in their organizations. And if you're wondering why we actually have three leaders in global health, it's because there's a rich, I think, activity area of shared value within global health. We've been talking about that quite a bit today. And we see some real innovation, and we see some real leaders in that particular area. So please join me in welcoming the three leaders here today, and I'm going to quickly introduce them. We have right here Adrian Gore, who is the CEO of Discovery. Now, Michael Porter talked about Discovery this morning. This is the fascinating insurance company based in South Africa that now has moved well beyond South Africa and has really brought together the social or the health impacts with its subscribers with the business benefits. It's a fascinating story. Next, we have Karl Hofmann. And Karl is the CEO of Population Services International, PSI, which is a leading international NGO, very innovative. It has always worked with the private sector. But more recently, the organization has been engaging in some very interesting and deep shared value partnerships with, for example, Lilly. And that brings me to Dr. John Lechleiter, who is the chairman, president, and CEO of Eli Lilly and Company. And you'll hear about the very interesting journey that John has been on. He is a leader among multinational CEOs in really embracing the shared value outlook. So I'm excited, I hope all of you are, to hear really kind of what's in the mind, what has been the journey of these three CEOs. So first what we'll do, we'll go down the line here, start off with Adrian, and hear a bit about the vision, or about this journey of shared value. Then I'll ask some spicy questions to make sure that we're all awake. And then we'll actually invite questions from you, from the audience, okay? So Adrian, let's start to hear about Discovery, which we have a nice foundation from Michael.
Thank you. So, thanks for that. Can you hear me back there? No. Talk very quietly. So, let me start by just thanking you for the introduction. As you've heard, we're a life.
We're going to turn.
Yeah, I think you have to bring it up a little bit higher.
Check. It's off. There we go.
There we go.
Thank you. Great start. So, I'm sorry. So we are, I think as you heard, a life and health insurer out of South Africa. But we've kind of globalized into 7 markets now. And we built our business on a very simple, but I think fairly compelling vision or purpose, make people healthier. That's been our kind of battle cry, our North Star. It's about everything that we've done since the founding of Discovery. I'm convinced that the business model we've created is applicable to global insurance, and I think through that process we can really disrupt global insurance markets, both life and health, and in fact motor insurance and others, through this idea of shared value insurance. It's important I provide I've got a bit of time, is that right? Provide a bit of context. As you heard, we're a South African insurer. The company was started in 1992. And just to understand, we started in South Africa in a very difficult time. Nelson Mandela was just released. The country was going out of apartheid into a democracy. And kind of the really complex question was, how do you build a health insurance company in a very complex environment? Just bear in mind, we have the highest levels of HIV/AIDS. We have all of the infectious diseases, the non-infectious diseases. There's a quadruple disease burden in our country. Secondly, we have too few doctors. So the doctor density is just too little. We probably need 4 times the number of doctors that we have. And then finally, and I think correctly, our government has a very, very egalitarian mindset about insurance, which I think is right given our past. So, but like the Obamacare, you can't rate people differently, you can't decline people, you can't use actuarial rating factors in the pricing of insurance. So when you kind of combine these factors together, the question was, how do you build a sustainable health insurance company? And I think our epiphany was the simple idea of making people healthier. If you focused on the demand side, on the patient, could you bring the demand for healthcare down, and in that process create a sustainable health insurance model? And that's kind of how we started. The truth is, and this is my opinion, I think trends in the world, globally in most markets, are directionally in the same way. There are a few things. Firstly, I think millennials, the people that we're serving more and more, have a very different perspective about institutions. They are civically minded, they expect engagement, etc. The second point I think is quite critical. People are living longer, and they're living longer sicker, and that creates all kinds of actuarial and clinical problems. The third issue you know well, but it's important to put it here, is technology. Technology is rapidly disrupting most industries. In our space, wearable devices, Fitbit, Apple Watch, these are wonderful things. They really are enablers, and this is really creating a whole kind of move towards the quantified self, and I think that's fantastic. But the real disruptive force I'd put to you, something that may be a bit more obscure, is the nature of risk itself has dramatically changed in sickness and in mortality. So in wellness and mortality, things have changed. And the fundamental change over the last number of decades has been a move from pre-existing risk to behavioral risk. Mm-hmm. The fact that most of the mortality and morbidity risks that people face is based on decisions that they make behaviorally. I kind of like this mnemonic. It's not that accurate, but I think it is very good. 3, 4, 50. 3 lifestyle choices: smoking, poor nutrition, poor physical activity, create 4 conditions: cancer, diabetes, heart and lung disease, that drives 50% of mortality and 80% of the global disease burden. It's a remarkable statistic, and that is at the core of kind of the disruptive force in the life and health insurance markets. The obvious question that will kind of define our business model is, why, if these decisions are so critical to the way people live, why do they make them? Why are people so irrational? And we know more and more from behavioral economists that people don't act rationally. They act very irrationally. In the context of this, the well-known healthcare paradox, that we know now that healthcare is overconsumed, wellness and prevention is underconsumed. And the reason I think is actually quite simple. Healthcare at the point of care is free. It's paid for by government in some countries or insurers, so it's free at the point of care, but the benefits are immediate and obvious and evident. Whereas in the case of wellness, it's the other way around. At the point of doing it, the price is high. You've got to do things you don't want to do, go for that run you don't want to go for, avoid the food you want to eat, and the benefits are 20 or 30 years away. So we're learning from over-optimism and what they call hyperbolic discounting that people want instant gratification, and so they kind of put off doing wellness activities. That's a critical issue, because I would put it to you, and I hope you agree, that insurers like us really monetize behavior around sickness and around longevity. That's what we do. So we have the resources to change behavior, and that is at the core of what we did as a company. The simple idea of really creating shared value from the get-go. So using financial incentives to almost bribe, in a way, benevolently bribe people to behave differently. Their behavior creates profitability in the system, actuarial surplus, using some of that surplus to fund the incentives. And so you get this kind of virtuous cycle of really institutionalizing shared value. Value goes to the customer, the member, value goes to the insurer, and you get this virtuous cycle of better behavior. That's what we did. The manifestation of that for us has been our Vitality program that's in fact present in the US, but effectively what it does is a very simple, we think, intuitive idea for customers. They do healthy things across the board, physical activity, nutrition, prevention. They earn Vitality points, gives them a status from blue to gold or platinum, and they get really substantial rewards. But behind the scenes, we've created a very, very complex actuarial clinical tool that links into the pricing of insurance. And in effect, as people do this, what they pay comes down, and so they can save considerable amounts of money in the process. So all parties, I would argue, are satisfied. We certainly are. We have a differentiated product. We have something that really does social good. Our business is highly profitable, but the real thing is our customers are healthier, and our customers see real value, not just in centers, but in fact in better health. So, I would say to you that if you look at Discovery today, we've grown a business from a startup in 1993 to an $8 or $9 billion company today. We serve 6 million customers with 10,000 employees. So the company has grown really well. But I think more important for us has been what we've done to our customers. 6 million people we serve, the intensity of activity in healthy things. People engaging show 15 to 20% lower healthcare costs. We've seen great experience on life expectancy, just given the samples that we have. So we're really getting really, really good traction. The point I'd leave you with is just to say that I do believe that we have the opportunity to globalize this and to change, because I think insurance is a trigger event. If you can change people, there's a knock-on effect. So we are in the process of working with, I think, some of the best companies globally to embed the model in their insurance businesses in the same way. So we formed, in effect, a Vitality Alliance. In Asia with AIA, which is the largest Pan-African insurer. In China with Ping An. In Europe with Generali. Here in the US with John Hancock, that you may have seen. And effectively in the UK and our home market, that's where we are. So what we're trying to do, and I believe it's doable, is through this mechanism, really globalize the concept of shared value insurance and make, I think, a remarkable effect, not just on the markets from a financial perspective, but more importantly, in changing people's lives for the better and getting back to our purpose, which is make people healthier. That's my
Adrian, thank you.
Amazing.
And you have a behavior change friend sitting right next to you.
Thank you, Kyle. It's an amazing story, Adrian. First, before I say anything, I want to just acknowledge my humility at being here in front of this audience. I feel like we're in the temple, the cathedral of shared value, and we are but neophytes, learning at the knee of many who have done amazing things. And so I've learned a lot just today, and I appreciate all that we learn together from this. So this is Sarah. She is probably not a Discover client, not yet, at least. She lives on $1 to $2 a day. She suffers from communicable disease burdens and non-communicable disease burdens. She's let down by the public sector, which by definition is pretty weak wherever she lives and doesn't serve her very well. She gets her health care from the private sector disproportionately, but she may be pretty disappointed in the private sector because the private sector may not be very good in serving her. She has choices. She has some disposable income. She has to use it to choose between education and health often, or hard choices like that. But most often she faces obstacles as opposed to choices. She may not be able to have access to modern contraception, and she may want it in order to limit the size of her family. She probably doesn't have access to clean drinking water. She wants that, but it may be beyond her reach. She almost certainly doesn't have access to improved sanitation. And as a result, her family, her community suffers from a lot of waterborne diseases. She may have children who have died at a very young age because she lives in a part of the world where ending preventable childhood deaths has not yet reached its full maturity. She's a victim of patriarchy and institutions that are stacked against her, and traditions and history, and probably bad luck. She is in many ways the face of global poverty. And she lives in not just in lower income countries, much of the places where PSI works around the world, But she also increasingly can be found in middle-income countries, where incomes are rising, but large pockets of the population may be left behind by that rising tide. And as I said, she is a victim of all of those forces. But we look at her fundamentally as a consumer. My organization, PSI, as Kyle mentioned, we were founded 45 years ago basically on this premise, that this audience, and we call her Sarah, she's our archetype. Sarah is fundamentally a consumer with choices, and she deserves the dignity of being marketed to. And being marketed to vis-a-vis the behaviors that she adopts for her own health, for the health of her family, and ultimately for the health of her community. We are a nonprofit social marketing company. That's the doctrine that we employ to reach our target audience, Sarah, around the world. And social marketing, which has been around for a long time, is, I would say, a cousin of behavioral economics, and in another guise might be termed human-centered design. But it's basically about using marketing and the principles of marketing and working with the private sector and through the private sector to reach a target audience and to convince them to change a behavior. That might involve a product, might involve a service, might involve just a behavior for the benefit of the individual, but also for the benefit of the community and ultimately the nation. We measure our impact through DALYs, disability adjusted life years. It's a wonky concept. Some of you may know it. It was developed by the World Bank and World Health Organization some time ago as a way to measure how to make investments in the area of global health. But for me, for my nonprofit, DALYs are my retained earnings. It's what the board of directors holds me accountable for, maximizing DALYs. And Sarah represents the mother lode of DALYs. She has the greatest burden of disease. She suffers most. She dies prematurely. She suffers great disability from the disease burden that she faces. And last year, PSI around the world, we were able to avert almost 60 million DALYs, 60 million years of healthy life that Sarah otherwise would have lost. Through social marketing, through approaching her problem set from the perspective of both supply and demand. How do we modify her demand? How do we provide a supply where there isn't one? And that could be in contraception. It could be in long-lasting insecticide-treated mosquito nets. It could be in behaviors relating to non-communicable diseases. And increasingly through also social franchising, which is a cousin of social marketing, we're using these tactics to reach 10 million consumers a year through our social franchise networks in 20 countries, and tens of millions of consumers a year, right, for healthcare products and services. And by partnering with the private sector everywhere we do, we're aiming to achieve cost-effective health impact at scale. Now, non-communicable diseases, as many have mentioned already and as we know, represent a great opportunity for a shared value approach to this problem set. We know that even in the lowest income countries, non-communicable disease burden is rising. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, where gross national product may be very low and per capita income is very low, the disease burden from non-communicable diseases is growing steadily. There is little donor funding for this, unlike what has happened with communicable disease, where we do see progress against malaria and yes, even HIV. There's little donor funding for work against non-communicable diseases. It's an impact opportunity for us, and it's a market opportunity for the private sector. So as a result of that, for example, we work with AstraZeneca on screening and treating hypertension in Kenya. We work with Novo Nordisk on dealing with gestational diabetes in Central America. And we're very proud of a partnership that we have with Lilly in India around diabetes, around screening, prevention, treatment, and management of diabetes, which is a huge health burden in India. For us, it's a flagship partnership that has been built on principles that we think are essential for a successful shared value relationship. That is investment on the part of both parties. Treat it like a grown-up partnership. Understand that both need to bring resources to the table. On iteration, a recognition that it's often going to fail in early stages, and you have to have patience and the speed of iteration so you can fail fast and learn from that. And on a premise of shared metrics, understanding what the measurement of success will be in this partnership. Shared value partnerships, such as we have with Lilly in India, have allowed us to leverage the existing infrastructure and really make a difference against what we know is a big driver of the burden that Sarah faces. So to close, it brings, for us, I think, us closer to cost-effective health impact at scale, and we'd like to believe that it brings Lilly closer to the future growth market that Lilly sees in India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karl. That's a great segue for you, John. And you've been a supporter of the Shared Value Initiative since day one. I think the folks in the room would love to hear, about your journey, including these partnerships, and about, how you've embraced and how you've been challenged by shared value.
Well, thanks, Kyle, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm quite humbled when I see who's represented in this room, because what I will describe is really a journey. And as I said when we were meeting before coming into the session, I don't think we'll ever snap the tape, but I'd like to think we're making progress on that journey. But hopefully what I have to say will resonate with some of you who are also on this shared value journey together. And what I'm not going to be able to do is talk about the dozens and dozens of partners that we have. So while I'll use the word Lilly, whether it's PSI, who's a vital partner for us in India on the project that I'll describe, or Doctors Without Borders, the International Nurses Group, we've had dozens and dozens of partners, and this whole thing could not be realized without us really leveraging the skills and ability of so many others. So the framework I want to talk about is one of a progression from what we refer to as more traditional philanthropy through, something that's been defined over the years as corporate social responsibility, CSR, then ultimately shared value. I think there are, there's not a distinct compartments you can put these in, and I don't think that shared value necessarily means that there's not a role for traditional philanthropy. But I think for Lilly, we were all traditional philanthropy not that long ago. We have a great heritage as a company. We just on Sunday had our 139th birthday, not that we're keeping track. And we felt the influence of the Lilly family for about the first 100 years of our company's existence. The grandson of our founder passed away in 1977. But way back in the late 1800s, his father, the son of our founder, made this quote, J.K. Lilly. He said, quote, "Every man should, in addition to his endeavors for personal and family gain and comfort, unselfishly perform some duties as a citizen for the community in which he and others live, move, and have their beings." Well, if you take away the masculine pronouns in the 19th century phrasings, I think that was sort of at the root of a philanthropic tradition that lived on, not just in the company, but in the Lilly Endowment, which the two grandsons founded in 1937. We've had a rich tradition of giving and philanthropy within Lilly that's been manifest in many ways, and we're historically, one of the top companies ranked by dollars and product contributions and all of that. I think, though, that beginning late in the 90s, we began really to think a lot harder about how do we go from philanthropy to make a more impactful and maybe more meaningful contribution, which recently has been enhanced by the desire of many of our newer, I'll say younger employees to really literally get engaged in this process. They're willing to give money, but they want to be part of helping create solutions and take a hands-on role. The next step in our journey began in 2003 when we announced a very ambitious effort to try to help diagnose and treat multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, mainly across 4 countries, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There's a long story here. We were, the Partners in Health group, Dr. Paul Farmer, essentially came to Lilly at one point and said, you make these two older, very old antibiotics. We weren't making much because there wasn't much demand. He said these are uniquely effective in treating this multi-drug resistant TB problem, which at that time very few people knew about, but which was growing in importance and virulence. So we got involved in a program now that will run through 2016. We will have invested about $170 million, but it's not a philanthropic investment. What we've done is to transfer the technology to manufacture these two drugs to key manufacturers in each of these countries to make these locally available. We've also been engaged in training healthcare workers, and there's quite a bit of training involved to accurately and more thoroughly diagnose and treat MDR-TB. Now, I feel like we took a half step towards shared value there because we were certainly putting into play something we knew a lot about, i.e. manufacturing technology and infectious disease in general. Lilly was probably the biggest company in the infectious disease medicines area up until the mid-90s or so when our business transitioned into other disease states. So we found ourselves at sort of the beginning of this decade asking, what is the next step on this journey from philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, shared value? And we really lighted on NCDs, non-communicable diseases, at the same time, roughly, that the United Nations was really looking at this and understanding better that these do represent the future disease burden, not only in developed countries, but in most developing countries. I recall a conversation I had with the health minister in China 3 or 4 years ago, and I said, what are you most worried about as you look across the landscape? He said, diabetes, because he knew, and we know, the long-term complications of that particular non-communicable disease, which happens to be an area Lilly knows a lot about. We were the first to bring commercial insulin to the market back in 1923, and it remains a very important part of our business. Today, nearly 400 million people, as of last year, had diabetes on this planet. We think roughly half, a little less than half, don't know they have it. They haven't been diagnosed, and without a diagnosis, it's very difficult to seek the correct treatment. In 4 countries where we've launched our NCD program, which began back in 2011 and runs at first tranche for a 5-year period, 2012-2016. In the 4 countries where we're present today, India, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico, between 9 and 12% of the populations in those countries have diabetes. So there's a huge disease burden, but there are different systems of care, different economic circumstances, different traditions, and frankly, different resources available in these various areas. So what we've begun to do, partnering with different partners in each country, PSI is our key partner in India, we've begun to work in a framework that we call research, report, and advocate. We are basically undertaking projects aimed at helping us understand in those countries how can diabetes, first of all, be prevented, what behavioral health and other measures need to be put into place to help prevent diabetes. That's possible, but once someone develops diabetes, how can we help them achieve a diagnosis? How can we help them get to treatment? And ultimately, how can we improve health outcomes, longevity, avoiding some of the serious complications of the disease down the road? We're early on in this journey. We have a summit meeting coming up in Brazil in September that I'll be attending, where we're going to get our second sort of readout from our partners on the various projects, which range from educating kids about type 1 diabetes, helping mothers avoid type 2 after having gestational diabetes. In India, we have a huge project looking at about 400,000 people in 2 communities, one in the north and one in the south of India, to really understand treatment protocols. Similarly, in South Africa and in Mexico, working with the Carlos Slim Foundation, we're really helping measure what is now a national program aimed at doing a better job of treating type 2, mainly type 2 diabetes in Mexico. So hopefully you get some idea of this progression over time.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for that arc that you've laid out. Let me ask a provocative question of the three of you. You know, it's something that's probably on the minds of folks in the room. It's certainly something that I hear actually going out and talking about, you know, global health and the involvement of companies and international NGOs. And that is, you know, what's interesting about your three businesses and organization is that your products and services have a social purpose, have a health impact out of the gate. You wake up every day and you create shared value. That's not always the case for every company, every organization. My question, as you're now penetrating, you know, new markets, kind of thinking about access issues, working with companies, and really thinking about, you know, changing the behavior of people to improve their health. What makes this difficult? What's the challenge? What are the challenges that you've been experiencing as you've been pushing on the boundaries of your organizations and moving more into creating new shared value to address unmet needs? I don't know who wants to start.
I'll start. I mean, so we don't have, I wouldn't say we have a vast experience, but it's pretty concentrated over recent years, really trying to explore this space and understand how we take the rhetoric and turn it into reality and find those genuinely shareable metrics of success, right? Because there have been there's lots of goodwill in the partnership, but it's sometimes difficult to come to a conclusion about how we're actually going to, you know, find that elusive common ground. So I won't name the company. We started out doing something that was involving sanitation and water treatment in a major developing country market. It was very exciting to us because we saw it as really getting at some of the burden that Sarah faced, and we knew how to measure that impact. And the company was a very reputable company that has been mentioned here today as a leader, actually, in shared value initiatives. So it wasn't that they weren't interested, but somehow really getting the alignment that was necessary for it to go from pilot to scale eluded us. And that probably speaks to the fact that we didn't do the right design to begin with. So I know this point has been made. I've heard it made several times today. If you don't get the right design elements baked in from the ground up, that's mixing a lot of metaphors, but you know what I mean. Getting all of the agreement right from the start and designing the program effectively together, and making sure that all the stakeholders are bought into it. You know, I feel like we are a very willing partner for the right private sector partner, and we've certainly been able to encounter people who were willing on the private sector side, and yet it's been hard to get from pilot to scale. So I think that's it's not a given. It's not a given.
I think that just two things I would say. One, I think we do say to ourselves that probably the greatest contribution we can make in the area of shared value is to run a successful business. Because when we run a successful business, we're able to invest the R&D that ultimately produces new medicines. But I think that the challenge for us has been that there's still so much more we can do. And I think one of the challenges, realistically, and maybe some of you have experienced this, is at the top of the house, you know, a few of us and a number of my collaborators, Lilly, are here. We can sit back and see this, and it makes sense to us. But when we get down to the country level, it's a challenge. It's been a challenge to integrate this into the business. The country leaders tend to say, well, that nice philanthropic program's going on over there. And so we've got to move our own people along and our own cultures within our company. And believe me, you've been around 139 years, you've got a real thick culture, okay? It's like pushing molasses sometimes, but we're getting there. When we first launched the MDR-TB thing, that has nothing to do with me. And now when you go to China, you know, and you talk to the people leading the business in China, or you talk to the health minister, everybody knows about this. They see that as an important statement that Lilly's made in that country. I think with the NCD initiative, we've got even a better opportunity to integrate that into our diabetes business.
Sure, I don't know. Our challenge is really to repeat and scale our model. So it's fairly focused on getting traction, on getting people to appreciate what we do, on illustrating value. And to an extent, I think our biggest challenge is different cultures interpret things differently. No matter how simple they appear to you, no matter how common sense they are to you, when you go into another culture, there's differences. One of the markets we're in, I always remember this, the idea of paying for insurance and not getting money back is a very foreign concept. I think in developed markets we know that. We pay and we understand probabilistically someone gets paid out. In one of the markets we're in, we battle to illustrate value of the underlying product. And one individual had it's anecdotal, but one individual had a massive health claim that was fully covered, great health care, etc. But they were very upset with the product. The reason is because they believed buying the health insurance made them sick. Right? So it's kind of different nuances as to how people see things. And therefore, as I've tried to explain it, I hope it didn't sound any hubris. I think we certainly are learning a lot. But these simple steps to get them into other countries and other cultures and get people to appreciate how they work is a very, very complicated process. So I would guess that would be our biggest challenge.
Behavior change is not easy. Please send in your questions. Start sending them in because we'll look at them in a second. One of the things that Michael Porter talked about this morning, but just touched upon it, is the role of the investor, which is really interesting. I think we're just beginning to kind of scratch at this, but one can imagine the ability to kind of unlock shared value amongst many industries, particularly global health, when investors understand what's going on in a company when it comes to creating shared value. So a question for all three of you, and a little bit of a parenthetical. When I say investors for Karl, for PSI, perhaps we can talk about some of the donors, USAID, DFID. So my question is, where do investors come into this? How are you navigating, if at all, the conversation about shared value with your investors?
John?
Well, I think we used the occasion of our annual meeting last week to update our corporate responsibility agenda broadly. So certainly we've been talking about what we're doing here with investors. But I think most of our investors probably don't see this yet as something that ultimately could build real value as they measure it. But I think that's probably short-sighted, and I think we still have a lot to prove. I think investors want to see proven outcomes. I think they want to know that as the company invests in these shared value programs, that ultimately there's going to be a return. It's really new thinking, I think, for a lot of investors. Again, Mark, your paper came out when? In 2011. It's one of these big ideas that I don't think many people out there, not people in this room, but lots of others, haven't gotten their head around yet. And I mean, even to the extent that I think there's culture not just within Lilly, but within many companies, that this is separate and distinct. Here's what I'm investing in, and I guess I'll give you the allowance to do a little bit of that, because I think that's probably good for the company to be seen as being responsible. This is not what we're talking about here, and I think we need all of you to sort of help guide our thinking, because it is so new, and I think we need to continue to learn from one another in different industries and across different parts of the spectrum here, so that we're not only inspired, but that we see the guts of these new models emerge.
So I wish I had investors, actually, but
Donors.
I have donors. I mean, I love my donors, don't get me wrong, but in a sense, they are the uber activist investor, right? They can be very dictatorial about the outcomes that they want. I would say that most donors, I think, in the nonprofit space, like the idea of shared value partnerships. They love the idea that their public money is going to fund some social good through an NGO, and it's going to be leveraged into bigger impact by that NGO partnering with a business. I think in principle they love that. But it gets complicated in the sense that they tend to be very directive in terms of what steps should be taken. And I think the burden of disease, which should be driving, for example, our internal investments in interventions that will generate the most DALYs or avert the most DALYs, are not necessarily what our activist investor donors are paying us to do. So that's a challenge for us.
Again, I think our challenge is maybe easier because it's our core business. So effectively, our investors have been happy provided we grow our earnings, at the right level. I think that's always hard to achieve. But I will say this: I think initially when we IPO'd and our purpose was make people healthier, this is 10, 15 years ago. That concept was completely foreign. It sounded like just this guy's an idiot, But over time, it's amazing how I think the world has changed, that there's a much greater appreciation for social good, for businesses' role in a much bigger way than just a kind of a box of CSI, but really a social impact. So to an extent, we've had a fairly easy time. I will say the framing of shared value is something we haven't really used. I mean, I heard Professor Porter give a lecture 3-4 years ago, and after listening, it took me a long time to work out. I think we're doing some of that. We didn't start out saying create a shared value model. So I think our message is forming, but I think you have to. I think I'm being verbose. I'm making the point that I think investors appreciate a company that does good for society. If you can do that and deliver on your numbers, I think there's a great appreciation for what you're doing. That's been our experience.
That's terrific. Thank you for that, and probably some education also needed as well. Well, why don't we have the questions come in? We have a lot. And I have to figure this out. They're moving around.
Wow.
Well, let's tackle this one. This one is interesting. So this one that just got 8 votes. How do you instill shared value in your leadership team? So the people, I don't know what number that is, but people who are, really working with you every day. And then how are you translating that? I'll take a little amendment here. How are you translating that down to the rest of your staff? Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll start. At the end of my remarks, I didn't have time to get to it, but were a few sort of challenges that I would pose. And this is actually one of those. I'm not going to be CEO forever. None of us are going to be in our positions forever. How do you create, the sustainability within the enterprise to see these things through? Well, I think one way of doing that is to make multi-year commitments that none of your successors can get out of easily.
Yeah.
Once you go on the public stage and say, this is what we're going to do, a lot of people second guessing you, but they don't dare change it, okay? But I do think that we need to think about this more. I think we could do a better job still within Lilly of really, we could do more on internal communications. But I do think about that. I do think of the cadre of executives that are going to be running the company in 10 years. And so we are trying to on-ramp, those folks to make sure that the concept's understood and that this thing has legs, because it is a journey. And we have much more progress to make.
I wonder about, on both the corporate and the nonprofit side, and I'm obviously much more familiar with the nonprofit side, I've heard it mentioned today that there's the perception that, and actually it's absolutely true, the nonprofit space probably could benefit from some mergers and acquisitions, right? There are too many nonprofits, but we're not set up to do that. It's very hard for us to do that. So there tends to be a balkanization in the nonprofit space, and today's competitor is tomorrow's collaborator. That has good and bad aspects to it. As we think about shared value partnerships, we may be working with Lilly in one place and with Lilly's competitors in some other place, and I'm wondering whether that poses tensions for you, John, for Lilly in any way. I know the challenges. I don't think there's really a challenge for us because we look at that as we can get value from all those partnerships. But how does it play for you?
It's of no concern. I think one of our competitors, Novo Nordisk, I think might be represented here. Diabetes is such a huge problem that we want to see them make progress. And I hope they'd like to see us make progress because we've got to learn from one another. This is an epidemic that sort of snuck up on us in the last 20 to 30 years, and we need all the work, all the support, all the ideas we can get in the mix. That's my view.
I would maybe add that I think in a leadership team or a management team, there are always detractors. I mean, it's just kind of a distribution of people and how they see things. There are always kind of bottom line people who focus on profit, and we always see this stuff as kind of an overhead, I think. It may be different in a not-for-profit environment, but certainly in ours, I think that if you can show hard measures of impact, I think that gets detractors over the line. In other words, in our business, people are used to illustrating actuarial profits, loss ratios, return on embedded value, etc. When you actually show life expectancy has been increased, admission rates to hospital have gone down. If you can do that, then I think you get people bought in. But I think the CEO's role is crucial in keeping the message going. I mean, that's been certainly my experience.
So we're going to stick with you because we've got 16 votes for a question about discovery, and I think that Michael Porter did a great job today in explaining that case, and I think really convincing us that this is your strategy. This was kind of part of your DNA from day one. And I guess a question that has been posed is, how do you maintain that competitive advantage? But like John, I think other competitors entering the space doing similar things is probably good. We're collaborators. So I think it legitimizes the model. But there are a lot of pieces to what we do that are difficult. I think the data, the actuarial understanding of segmentation of risk by engagement is a very big asset that we've managed to globalize through certain structures. I think the elements of everything to do with the engagement, the partners, the technology that underpins it is all, I think, very competitive and very fast developing. But there's no hubris. I think competitors are doing it, and I think they'll do it incredibly well. I think we see companies like Humana that are here that we've worked with. These guys are doing a great job. So the truth is, my sense is that I think we're red hot competitive. This is a model that we pioneer, but I don't have any hubris that we can just claim the space. I think we have to keep working. I also think that the partners we work with in different countries, we've chosen carefully that they are in themselves very competitive and big. So using their leverage in their markets are powerful. So it is a network kind of business. The more that gets going, the harder it is to break in. But no hubris. There's a lot to do. Great. Cool. So I'm going to end this with a question about advice. What advice might you have? But I'm going to put a little spin on it. And the spin is, what advice do you have for somebody else on the panel? So, John, if you want to give advice to Karl, since you've worked with PSI, as you think about their particular industry, what advice do you have for them as they engage and deepen shared value? Take your pick.
Well, I think that oftentimes the view people believe we take within corporations, a short-term view is wrong. I mean, how does Lilly exist for 139 years? You do that by taking a long-term view. I think that corporations oftentimes sort of feel shunned a bit by the not-for-profit community, who we believe often ascribes base motives to what we want to do. Oh, you want to get in this because you can make a profit. I mean, this needs to be understood in the right context, sure, obviously. But I think that, again, those of you in this room who are not part of for-profit organizations like I am, I would just encourage you to reach out to corporations where you see the opportunity for them to contribute to a shared value proposition in a meaningful way. Educate them, work with them, because believe me, we are all being driven today by what I call the youth movement to show that we are not only interested in making a profit, but that we're also interested in making somebody's life better. And they want real proof of that. This isn't smokescreen, camouflage, philanthropy. That's not going to do it. So, pull us in.
Yeah, and my reaction to that is, of course, don't worry, you had us at hello, John. we get that.
You do.
We get that. Profit, the large enterprises that you represent have been these tremendous means of generating value for shareholders, yes, But for stakeholders and the broader society, absolutely, undeniably. And that's been the story of much of the progress of the past 100 years, I would say. And so up to us in the nonprofit space that are trying to scale our impact to figure out what to borrow from your model, what to criticize you on when necessary, but fundamentally how to work with you, because this is a huge engine of progress and value creation. And we get that. We get that.
Adrian, you have the last word of advice.
Look, I think I come from a country where there are considerable inequalities and major social challenges. So a company in a field as complex and as important as health and healthcare, profit and doing good are often a very complicated tightrope to walk. Having said that, I just reiterate what both my colleagues have said. I think that we're in a new world. I think there is an appreciation on both sides, not-for-profit and for-profit, that collaboration is critical. You know, breaking down the barriers of preconceived ideas about motive is a crucial thing. And I'd agree with that. I think that shared value and all these other movements illustrate that we all have a common interest. And I think that if we break those barriers down and work collaboratively, I think shared value is one of those means that will do that. I think we have an amazing ability to make a real sustainable difference.
Thank you. And then perhaps for me, just one last concluding comment. You know, it's interesting. All day we've been talking about big things. You know, the scale and the ambition, the promise of shared value. You know, it's interesting. When it comes down to it, the success of shared value often resides in the individual. In the individual passions and motivations of leaders like the three that we have on the stage. And I think that's important to bring into the conversation. You know, we need the scale, we need the partnerships, we need the strategy, but we need that personal passion. Mm-hmm. And that's all within you too. And we thank you for being here. And I want to actually thank all of you. And let's give a round of applause for our three shared value heroes. And with that, the day is concluded, and you can all toast each other right outside there. Thank you.